Okay, good day everybody. I'm Joson, fourth year IMC, and with me today is...
I'm IC Suarez, a first year in MEM, and...
Without further ado, come as you are, come watch or come listen, because all hands are on deck. Alright, so school is hard. We all know that. But on top of that, we've all had our fair share experiences with professors that have made it even harder for us. We hear about this all the time. The boogeymen of educational institutions, terror profs. Every student's nightmare. Today we're going to be talking about challenging your students and how this differs from quote-unquote terrorizing them.
So where exactly do we draw the line between terror and a challenge? How do students typically experience this, and what students might be able to do if they were to encounter professors such as this? Today our guest speaker is SEM legend Doctor Robert Cortes. He is joining us today to help us offer some insight into a perspective of what terror profs might be and how might affect the students.
So welcome, Doc. It's good to have you here.
Thank you.
Pleased to have you here, actually.
Thank you for having me.
But before
I'm not sure what sort of legend I have.
But yeah, you are seen as such. Okay, and before anything else, we'd like some further background into how long have you been teaching in school, like what subjects have you taught?
I have been teaching in the university for a little over 10 years. I was, technically I just finished my 10th year last year, but I've been here since 2010 actually. 2 years I was out. I studied in Rome, 2 years my PhD in social communication. That's how I ended up in SCM, but I began teaching English here in 2010, left for my PhD in around 2014, if I'm not mistaken. Then when I came back, I joined the School of Com. I teach ethics, I teach entertainment, cultures and society for MEM. So that's about it.
Okay, so have you ever been labeled as a terror prof?
Yeah.
Oh, you have? it's reached
Pretty
you.
much, yeah, pretty much. So this is Rich, me talking to you about what terror proofs, what did you say?
It's okay.
Proof of terror profs.
Yeah.
I'm a proof of a terror prof.
I see. So as someone labeled as a terror prof, how necessary do you think it is to, challenge your students to the extent of being labeled as a terror prof?
First, let me just clarify that, and this may be insightful to you, that I have been labeled a terror prof and maybe still am labeled as such, but I never considered myself as a terror prof. Right? I had some insights as well, of course. Hearing all of these things of terror prof has made me also reflect on myself and what is it in me that make people think that I'm a terror prof. And I think the first thing would probably be that I'm strict, that I do have, I do demand high standards from my students. In what we're saying here is like, I do challenge my students, right? I challenge them, and you're asking if it's necessary to challenge your students. I think we can all agree that if you were not challenged by your teachers, you would think the teacher boring, right?
That is true.
You probably in class, you'd tell this teacher, oh, how much we like you, and all that, but behind his back, you're actually laughing because you could easily get uno. It's like just a walk in the park.
Yes.
Right? And you're not learning anything. And so I think we can all agree that teachers need to challenge students. The same way as, a lot of people go to the gym.
Yeah.
You challenge yourself. You lift weights. You challenge your muscles to grow, to make them grow.
Exactly.
And I guess that's why we challenge students, because we think that only through challenges can we make people grow.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes, it definitely seems that you have your students' best intentions in mind.
Mm-hmm.
So with that being said, if you go too easy on them, what do you think, how will it affect them in the long run?
Well, I guess in the same way as, for example, you go to the gym thinking that you want to grow a lot of muscles, but every time you go there, you decide to just lift, 2 pounds.
Yeah.
Yes.
How do you think will that
Nothing
benefit you?
Not much.
Right? So I guess that's just how it is. So I think all students do. This is what I think. You can correct me if I'm wrong.
Right.
All students come to school wanting to be challenged, right?
Yes.
But I think they want to be challenged in the proper way, and they want to be challenged according to their capacity, or at least what they perceive is their capacity.
Right.
Yeah.
And it is now up to the professor, who is supposedly the adult in the room, to determine what exactly is this student's capacity, and to try to estimate that capacity as correctly as possible, if that were possible.
So would you say a challenge is a way to measure one's capacity?
No, the challenge is a way to increase that student's capacity. Right, because a student comes into the classroom with this much capacity, and I think the professor's task is to increase that, because the mind, the spirit, the soul, the whole being of the student, and I use those terms deliberately, and they're nuanced, they're specific. I mean, they're really quite distinct. I mean, from each other. The human mind, the human possibilities is infinite. So we're infinitely elastic. We're infinitely elastic. Yes, they're stretchable.
Yes.
Stretchable. And it depends on the teacher, on the professor. It's his duty, it's his task to in fact effect that expansion. But that has to be done gradually, and it has to be done according to the capacity of the right according to the right pace for each student. Now here's the challenge though, because each student in the room has different bases. I mean,
Yeah.
they have a different what's the word for it? They don't develop at exactly the same pace.
At the same
Right?
rate.
At the same rate. I mean,
Yes.
yeah. Okay, good. Thank you. We're individuals. We're unique. So the teacher has to put that into the calculus whenever he or she is dealing with each and every student, and perhaps this is where the problem comes, because the teaching is a very challenging thing, because you have there 30, 25, 40, sometimes 60
Right.
individuals in the room, and you have to get things done.
All different characters.
Yeah, all different characters, different paces, different rates of development, etc., coming from so many different backgrounds, right? And how do you finish the syllabus, for example? How do you get the job done? And sometimes I think teachers just and I'm not saying this, to put any teacher down. Teachers just want to get things done, right? Because they have to report to the boss, to the dean, and they have to justify this, not fully discussing everything in the syllabus, and then they have to submit a report why. And so what can happen is that they just want to make sure that the syllabus is finished, the material is finished, and in the process they can actually bulldoze through so many other things. For example, students' feelings, that the people who are not catching up are having a hard time, so they just don't regard that anymore. They just go straight to the material, and sometimes they look like they've lost their temper because someone asked an honest question.
Right. It's like, as you said, that's probably why different people perceive terror profs in different ways. How some people may say, this prof is a terror prof, and some may say that he's not a terror prof, because, as you said, each person has a different growth rate, and that's probably why it's how people perceive a certain person that way.
Can I add?
Yeah.
Can I agree? And I agree with that fact. And I think sometimes, and to me as a student, and this isn't I don't have like an appropriate term for it, but this isn't to like kiss the profs like in schools, like butt cheeks or anything.
Sip, sip.
Sip,
Sip, sip.
Okay, but sometimes I do think it's a bit unfair because, as you mentioned, there are different profs have different approaches and students have different ways they want to be approached.
That is
And not every single time will a prof be able to cater to your needs and to how you feel. And sometimes, and I talked to IC about this before the episode started, that sometimes it's our fault why we're anxious of our professors. It's because we're aware that we're not prepared for their class. We came there not knowing anything, and then we get upset when we're called out for not being prepared enough. And then we label them as such when they give us a certain reaction. And I think that's sometimes unfair towards them because we know it's our fault, yet they're the ones who are quote unquote terrorizing us.
Talking about labels though, right? I think we started this conversation assuming that the label has been defined.
Yeah.
Right? Like you say, oh, have you been labeled a terror prof before? And I just said, yes, I was labeled. I have been called a terror prof, right? So it's like admitting that that label has existed for me, yes. But I think we need to define what the terror prof is, because I'd like to hear that definition, and I think that definition shouldn't come from me. I think it should come from the students who are the ones labeling professors as terror profs, right? So, what is a terror prof for you?
Would you like to go first?
To me, a terror prof is. I did talk about this before, that a terror prof to me is someone who, through their execution, doesn't necessarily have the students in their intentions for their students isn't necessarily the best in mind. Sometimes a prof who could get away with the self and not really realizing that their execution doesn't necessarily benefit the students to his or her utmost capability.
Okay, I appreciate your answer, at least coming from the fact that, I mean, if only for the fact that it's coming from your experience, I guess.
Yes.
But there are two things there that you said that I think we need to distinguish.
Right.
The first thing that you mentioned in the earlier part of your answer was that a professor comes to the classroom not with the student's best interest in mind.
Mm-hmm.
Then later on, you did say that they just don't know how to execute.
Yes, it's more of on the latter part of my
Exactly
response.
right.
Yes.
To the first part, because I think that is coming from somewhere as well, right? From somewhere. Do you think, and maybe I can also address this to Justin, do you think that a teacher or a professor ever comes into the classroom with not wanting to have the best interest of the students in mind? I mean, not having the best interest of the students in mind. So in other words, I come to the classroom wanting to destroy students practically, right? Because it's not their best interest.
Yeah.
Like, it's a euphemism for saying they're not their growth.
I don't think a prof comes into a classroom thinking, I will make sure that my students don't learn today.
Or that they will fail.
That they will fail. I definitely don't think.
I come to torture them.
No, I don't
Right?
think profs come into the classroom thinking that.
Okay.
It's more of sometimes. I think a lot of their profs.
But then that does come off
That's
as such, right?
Definitely. I think a lot of students can perceive a prof to be that way. But if you really put it in retrospect, if a student really comes to think about it, I don't think any person would become a professor to fail people.
Why?
I think teaching is quite a vocation. It's not only an occupation. It's really something that you choose to do.
Nobody ever, and I can say this for myself, nobody ever goes into teaching because he wants to get rich. Right? I mean, rich financially.
Yeah.
Right?
Rich definitely in experiences.
I mean, rich in terms of, human experience, rich in relationships with the eventual relationship that you make with it,
Of course.
rich in one's legacy,
Of course.
Yeah.
right? Because, well, Horace used to say that the greatest monument, the greatest monument, Horace used to say that I have built a monument made of bronze, and he was referring to himself, and he was referring for himself as his poems would be his greatest monuments, right? Not material things, because monuments would be destroyed in time, but his poems until now they've lived forever. But I think there's an even greater monument, and the great monument and the greatest monument is, I think, is one's impact on persons, on human beings. Because if we believe that human beings are immortal, then our impact on them is immortal, right? So, and that's from what I know, from what I have experienced. This is really what motivates most, if not all, teachers to spend the rest of their lives in the classroom, right?
And
So anyway, so at least we know that teachers don't go to the classroom to want to wreck their students' lives. But then the other part of your answer is that it does come off that teachers don't seem to know how to bring about the learning, and the
execution.
The execution
The execution of
is a
teaching.
problem. Yes.
Yeah, I agree. Just to add to her thought, I think that what makes a terror prof is when they forget that not every student will be able to catch the idea that they want their students to have.
Right.
And for me, immediately when I notice with certain, I do have professors that I do perceive as such, and I see them that way when I notice that whenever a student is able to make a mistake, when they do make a mistake, even if no matter how prepared they are, professors will have their expectations. I understand, and there's no problem with that. The problem comes along when a student makes a mistake, and instead of being corrected and then educated, they're corrected, and then the professor, instead of telling them how they can fix it, they're told how much more wrong they are, and that's very disheartening as a student. And I think what makes them terror profs, because there has to be a certain level of consideration to understand that, okay, it's not that they didn't prepare, they prepared but they didn't catch my idea, and that's fine. And as a student, you have to understand that, okay, I wasn't prepared enough, but I appreciate that he corrected me rather than telling me how wrong I am, because there has to be a gray area. And I think in that way, they wouldn't be as scary or be labeled as terror profs.
Very well said, coming from a student. And with that being said, I think I just want to read out a few anonymous testimonies regarding terror profs.
Please.
So the first testimony is, my professor for an entire semester refused any request for consultations and never released the answers for tests and quizzes. All you get is a score without any explanation whatsoever as to how you got it. This professor has been teaching for many years and uses years of experience as an excuse for aforementioned actions. This is an anonymous testimony from a fourth-year student. So, Dr. Cortes, what do you think about this testimony, and do you think the professor was being reasonable in this scenario?
Definitely. I'm sorry to say, yes. I have to agree that the students could have gotten a better reception or a better response from the professor, but then now it really makes me wonder if we're talking about a terror prof or a horrible prof.
Yes, sir.
I mean, I think there's a difference between a terror prof, the way you've been talking, and a bad prof.
What do you think is the difference? As a professor yourself,
a bad professor is one who is not he's not applying the proper principles of teaching, not proper principles of teaching, proper principles of learning, and proper principles of grading. Those are three things that one has to learn professionally
in order to
teach. Obviously, and this is not to sound condescending, but there is a difference between a professor who has professionally learned these principles because he has studied them either in university or in some professional development training which the university offers, or through YouTube, or simply through reading books and all of that. I think it is incumbent to every professor, whether every college professor, even if he's not trained professionally in the university, like he didn't finish an AB in education or a master's in education, but it is incumbent for each professor in the university, even if it's teaching chemistry or material science, or is there such a thing here? But anyway, or economics, to actually learn these basic principles of teaching, learning, and grading, because all of these inform his teaching, right? And it is when a professor does not know that all of these things have to be learned and have to be applied in the classroom, even as he teaches the basics of his own subject matter, just the specialization, that things like this happen.
In this scenario, I would like to ask why you think it's reasonable for the prof to do this.
No, it's not reasonable.
It's not.
Oh, it's not
That's
reasonable.
exactly what I'm saying. It's like, because part of the principles of teaching is that you need to give students feedback. And the more immediate the feedback, the better.
Yeah.
Because then you are helping the student be more in charge of his own learning, right? So if I tell you this is what you lack, nicely, in a healthy way, encouragingly, right? Then he can, presumably he can work on whatever he has to work on, right?
Yeah.
And then he responds by producing better results in tests or in essays or in the projects and so on and so forth. And not exactly, may I see what other thing that he did not do. And then of course all you get is the score without an explanation how you got it, right?
Yes.
Sometimes of course, sometimes we also need the students to take some initiative because of the there's just so many students sometimes, and the professor just simply out of practicality, you just give a score and that's it. If the student doesn't ask, then that means he's not interested. He or she is not interested, and therefore I think students also should take the initiative to ask, sir, why this or why that, especially for example if it's an essay. However, if the professor comes up as very, very unwelcoming and so rude, not strict, but rude, right? Then of course he's already putting an obstacle between him and the student for further interaction, right? But sometimes I have to encourage the students always to reach out to the prof, right? But then of course this whole idea of invoking his years of experience and all of that. No, we all know that. We all know that just doesn't make the cut, right?
Yeah.
Because wisdom is not necessarily. It doesn't automatically come with age.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
It doesn't necessarily come with age.
Yes.
So
All right. So we have another testimony. I'd love to hear your thoughts again on. So my professor enforces a no erasure rule during exams. There are multiple instances wherein my classmates and I knew the right answer but just accidentally misspelled it or put something else. We couldn't correct it and we got deductions despite knowing the right answer. And another student, first year. So do you think that the professor again was being unreasonable? Why or why not?
Okay, I don't want to be mobbed by angry professors after this. I don't want to be lynched. This is just from so let me be honest about it. Of course, I'm sure the professor has reasons
Yes.
for not no erasures. And one thing I can imagine is that possibly, erasures could hint at possible cheating and all of that, right? So no erasure. So, but it's not as if you cannot first cheat and then answer,
Yeah.
right? And then you don't have erasure, but you can still cheat.
Yeah.
So no matter how I think about this, because, I mean, this has been going on for quite some time, right? I just don't find any point in it. So I think it's unreasonable. Because I always compare students' experiences and teaching experiences to life.
Yeah.
So what we're supposed to be doing here in the university is to prepare students for life. And in life, you erase so many, you change so many things, and you're given all the chances,
Yes.
right? Now, probably some teachers will say, "Oh no, in this profession, you make one mistake and that's it, you're fired," and all of that. I don't know what world he's living in, because
It's not ours.
it's not ours, right? Because most companies, you're given a chance,
Yes.
Yeah.
and then you're like, so many chances, and in fact, in companies, this is what's encouraged, right? Openness, admitting your mistakes so we can help each other, and so on and so forth. So, perhaps the teacher doesn't realize that implicitly what you're conveying to the students, you mustn't make any mistakes, because if you make mistakes, you can't change your answer, right? So this is one of the reasons why I think it's absurd. And if you cannot erase, and you found out, you know the answer anymore, you know the answer already, then your score does not convey the reality. And the reality is, I know this much, but because of this stupid instruction,
Yes.
I am not conveying the exact thing that the exam is supposed to convey.
Yes.
The exam is supposed to convey how much the student has learned. But because of a foolish instruction, you're not getting it in the test.
Yes.
And you as a professor are perfectly satisfied with this score,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
There are also other stupid instructions, for example, like, you forgot to write your name, and so on and so forth. I remember one time, but this was before I came to the university. I was teaching in a private school for boys, and there was this student who almost perfected the exam, and this was a final exam,
Okay.
but he forgot to write his name.
And what did the prof do?
He gave him a 0.
Oh no!
Kind of gave him a 0. And it's like, wow. It's for me. It was just how, what, why, right? And so we seem to precisely overlook the purpose of exams. Exams are supposed to tell us what the students learn. Exams, project. What does the student learn? And if he failed because of a technicality, then we have just defeated the purpose of the test, of the exam, of the evaluation.
Yes, because forgetting to write your name isn't implicit of what you know
Yeah,
about the topic.
Yes, and in real life, you forgot to write your name. Whoever is in charge will say, hey, nakalimutan mo yung pangalan, pakisulat ko, kuya.
Yeah.
That's what happens in real life,
Yes,
right?
yes.
So in other words, the university is producing students for a different kind of world. A world where everything is, you can't make mistakes, a cruel world that does not forgive small mistakes and will claim the worst possible consequences for very, very small mistakes.
Yeah. So before moving on, I'm just curious because you mentioned that there's a distinction between a horrible prof and a terror prof. So for both the second testimony and the prof that you mentioned from the previous school you were in, do you think they were horrible or just terror profs?
The second teacher I was talking about, he is a very holy person, by the way.
I feel bad now.
I won't say more. I won't describe him further because you'll probably be scandalized, and I don't want to scandalize him. But I know he's a very good person, and right now he's doing a lot of good to a lot of people. He's not anymore a teacher in a strict sense. But I guess it's just that at that time I don't think he studied the principles of grading, principles of learning, principles of teaching. He did not study that as a profession, as an undergrad or even a master's when he became a teacher, right? So it's sometimes really just out of ignorance that the teachers that professors have all of these unhealthy practices in the classroom, which really don't help in the learning and in really assessing more accurately what the students are learning, and in the process not encouraging to learn further. So
Thank you, sir.
Yes, and in regards to that, it's as a student, it's truly frustrating to have to go through the experience of a horror prof or a horrible prof or a terror prof. So with that being said, do you know any systems in place that the students can use to improve or to counter the experiences that they have with the terror prof? Are there any places that they can report to, or any surveys perhaps?
Okay. As far as systems go, the university has it. I mean, they can always complain to the boss of the prof, like the vice dean or the dean, and you have the student, the school for student affairs, and all of that. And of course, the professor's attention will always be called, right? But then I would like to move beyond systems, because systems can only do so much, right? In the end, the real system that will address you might say, the flaws of the professor is in the students themselves. That's the real system. And I say this because the OSA, or is that OSA? CSA, sorry, that was another age. Yes, the CSA and the dean and the vice dean can talk to the prof and all of that. What if the prof is tenured? What if the prof is permanent? The dean or the vice dean can just talk to the prof, and the prof says, okay, in here, out there, not because he or she is malicious, but simply because he or she might really be convinced about her approach. It's a deep-seated approach, and she can't, unfortunately, you can't fire professors on these little, you might say technicalities and all of that stuff, and maybe the professor could also just do something minimally just to address what he or she was told, but in the end go back to the classroom with more or less the same bad effect and all of that, because he or she is convinced of the approach. So in other words, I think it would be better if students who are listening to this or watching this podcast would learn for themselves how to avert the effects of these professors whom they might meet, whom they consider terror profs, right? And I would say that's why I asked you a while ago, what for you is a terror prof, And I think we can both agree that a terror prof is only a terror prof if the student allows himself or herself to be terrorized by the prof. Right?
It's a different perspective, way of looking at it.
Huh?
Yeah.
I mean, why? Because I as a student can actually choose to look at this prof who's strict and demanding, or as not a terror prof. Which means to say, for example, I can say, this professor is strict. Let me name the exact complaint I have with this professor. Is it his strictness, or that he doesn't know how to teach, he doesn't speak straight English, or he doesn't know how to grade, or his tests are this. Let me name that, right? Let me name that. And then I can address each of those issues. So I would like to invite the students to be more proactive about their learning and about their about how they are affected by the professors. In other words, I'm actually inviting students not to feel victimized by the professor because you have it within yourself not to be the victim. And to be not the victim does not mean to fight the professor, but rather to have the proper mental attitude towards this particular professor. Also because all professors who come into the classroom, they have their own histories, they have their own struggles, they have their own challenges,
their
right?
own stories.
And I'm not saying this to justify all of these horrible things that you're experiencing in the classroom, but that just is a reality. Remember that the professor also has to contend with your challenges. I guess all of you students also expect you to be understood by the professor, but there are 30 of you. So the professor is actually in a more challenging position to have to understand all of you and try to balance everything. And so imagine if and not all professors are ready for it, I guess, mentally. And so that's why they fail in this or that particular aspect. Now, if each student tells himself or herself that whenever a professor does this, this is how I'm going to react it. So, for example, if a professor is simply strict because he's demanding of his deadlines, for example, then what can I do? Then I will have to be a little more orderly so I can meet the deadline. Right. So if the professor is just he is strict because he has all these rules in the classrooms, like no looking to the right or to the left. I'm exaggerating. At least I hope I'm exaggerating. Then maybe I can train myself not to look, or maybe mention it to the dean or to the vice dean and all of that. But so in other words, not to come into the classroom thinking that terror professors are terror professors and I can't do anything about it. That you can do something about it. In other words, you can always look at the different aspects of the terror professor, and you can always address those things. So now, another example, the horrible professor, like who doesn't seem to know how to grade, or that particular student, for example, about that thing. I mean, about the not giving the feedback and all that stuff. That thing that I suggested to you. Why don't you go and ask the professor for, ask it politely. Can you please explain? And so on and so forth, right?
What about in a situation where the student does take the initiative to approach the prof about feedback, and what if this prof is not receptive and they're insistent on their ways? What do you suggest the student does then in a scenario like that?
I know it's very difficult to ask students to not be disheartened, to not feel insulted, to not feel, but that's exactly what I'd like to challenge students to do, because it is, in a sense, preparing yourself for the real world, where you're going to meet bosses who are going to be very, very strict, quite dismissive, and all of. And what do? Do you just fold up, go to your corner, and cry, right? And then, sorry to have to mention this, but like invoke mental health and all of that stuff, right? We know that this mental health problem is a real problem, right? But then it doesn't help to allow yourself to just give in to your so-called vulnerability. We need to, not to sound chauvinistic, you need to man up. Or maybe a better way to say it, less chauvinistic, is to grow a spine, right? And how does one grow a spine? to accept all of these difficulties, all of these challenges, as precisely that means to make me stronger. Because as they say, you probably heard this, right? What does not kill you makes you stronger. You need to take that seriously. And I would like to invite everyone and challenge everyone to see terror profs as that, right? Okay, I was about to say something controversial. Don't believe in the myth of the terror prof. The terror prof is in your mind. In the sense that, as I say, a terror prof only exists if you allow the professor to terrorize you.
After all, it is the students that give the label to the prof as a terror prof.
Exactly. And sometimes, by the way, I'm beginning to get to know this philosopher named René Girard, who talks about mimetic theory. And mimetic theory is this idea that many times we like or don't like things, we react to things because we imitate the people. This is a very subconscious, unconscious thing about human beings. Human beings are mimetic beings. We imitate a lot, right? And so we foster this myth of the terror professor, and every generation that follows us thinks that this is a real thing. But as I said, if we don't allow the terror professor to terrorize us, then there's no terror professor. Rather, we have a professor who can challenge us, who challenges us, and he may be challenging us in a serious way. He may be challenging us in an irresponsible way. But it will always, if we see it as a challenge, right? Then there are no terror profs. They're only challenging professors. They're also horrible professors. But in a sense, they're also challenging us. I mean, they can also help us grow, right? I have such a horrible professor, but because of him, I decided to study the material on my own.
Yeah.
And then you learn. And of course, it's no thanks to the horrible professor that you learn the materials better, because now you read the materials. But in a sense, he was the occasion for you to read the material. Sometimes, by the way, professors we think are so good, so geniuses, they give you an illusion that you're learning, but you're not. You're just mesmerized by the genius of the professor. He is the sage on the stage. But a professor is supposed to be a guide on the side, right? And he makes you learn. He doesn't spoon feed the knowledge to you, right?
Yeah.
You learned it because he made you do something. And sometimes he does that because he's not the genius who can dish out all these nice lapidary statements, right, that you'd like to take notes of. And then God knows what you do with all those, thousands of pages of quotes and notes, and that's it, right?
Yes.
Anyway.
All right. So, thank you so much, Doctor Cortes. That was very insightful, And
it's over.
To close off, as students, we are expected to value the quality of education that we receive and maximize our learning in each class. The same as we expected of our professors, in the sense that our learning should be the topmost priority with teaching, and not giving one student a hard time. But as we've established just a few minutes ago, that sometimes you have to come in there and not label your prof as such immediately. Sometimes you really do have to take some hits and be open to making certain adjustments towards them, because as you're established, there's only one prof and there are 30 of you, and sometimes the prof won't be able to cater to all of our needs and our emotions. However, if the challenge posed to the student is only detrimental to their learning, I do think that effective education is not being delivered. So, terror profs do exist, and we hope this discussion validates those with similar experiences with such profs. If you're under a terror prof right now, or one that you think is a terror prof, make sure to give feedback at the end of the semester for the sake of the students that follow you. Thank you for tuning in on deck, and we'll see you in the next episode.
What?